So, hi, Jez. Thanks for joining us on this call. We're here to have a quick chat, reflection on some of the learning and experiences that you've been having at the Bristol Housing Festival at Bristol City Council. We came together through the Climate Smart Cities Challenge, and that's kind of the prompt for this conversation, where you've been working with UN Habitat, Viable Cities, Dark Matter Labs, and other partners to craft a challenge that you're working with in housing and climate change, and open it up to a whole range of innovators from the private and public sectors and third sectors to try and come up with a solution together. And it's been a really enjoyable sort of innovation process journey. And while we're going to not talk about the project as such today, I thought it would be great after our many conversations to have a chance to get 20 minutes of your time to ask you some questions about the journey that you've been through as you try to bring in an innovation culture and innovation process to delivering both affordable housing in Bristol that is also zero carbon and meeting a whole range of social goals. So your challenge is not small, but I think you've got some really interesting learning that you've had along the way that puts a lot of innovation theory and concept into practice. And that's why I thought this would be a really useful conversation for practitioners out there, both innovation practitioners, but also local government officials who are also grappling with similar challenges. So that's why we're here today, and I hope that's an exciting 20 minutes we've got planned.
Likewise, thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, Jez, maybe you could start by just telling us a little bit about what the Bristol Housing Festival is all about. You've been there for some time, and also its kind of relationship with the Bristol City Council, where you also play a role now.
Yeah, thank you. So I think the first thing to say is that we're still learning about this innovation journey, but we set up the Bristol Housing Festival in 2018, and the vision was very much to say, how could we set up a narrative for the wider city to engage with, so for the wider public, for the politicians, for the industry, to look at the challenge of our housing crisis as we face it in the city. And the vision of the festival was really to say, what could we then get done in 5 years, so almost utilising and working with our local authorities, a think and do tank as an R&D experiment. So we focused on three key issues. One was the housing crisis as understood and the lived experience within Bristol. The other was that sustainability and the environmental emergency of recognising that you can't look at just the housing crisis in isolation of that. And the third limb was particularly around the productivity and skills challenge that we face in the UK around, one of the problems we have is that we do not have sufficient sort of workforce and skills in the sector to deliver the solutions that we need. So 5 years, the vision of a festival being to deliver real change, not just sort of to have a showcase or to have a talk shop, but to partner to deliver real change that would then create cultural reformation really, and sort of scalable solutions that could be delivered not just in Bristol, but in other parts of the UK.
Great, thanks. I mean, you've touched, Jez, I think what's brilliant about what our experience of working with the Bristol Housing Festival has been, and Bristol City Council together, is that kind of complementary role that the two are playing in Bristol, and the role that the festival's playing in bringing together a kind of ecosystem of change makers, of partners, of stakeholders that can contribute to trying to meet some of the goals that you just outlined, the three ones you mentioned: the zero carbon challenge, the affordability, and also the whole supply chain construction piece that has to ultimately deliver on those other two areas. So, I mean, what if in your experience over the last few years, what has been sort of something that you're really proud of, I guess, where you think that Bristol City Council and the festival have led the way in kind of trialing something new? And I guess proud of, often we ask that question and people think they have to show the kind of perfect end result, but we're also interested here about process, because I think there's lots of case studies about what people ended up with at the end, but not a lot of detail on the journey that they took. So you could be proud of something very small in that journey, but what would you sort of, if asked that question, what would you lead with?
I think the learning journey, actually. So let me just break that down a little bit. When we got into this, we, as a group of individuals, so my colleagues and the festival, we set up to act as a convener and as an enabler to drive, almost as a catalytic solution. Say, look, how do we bring these different stakeholders together, working with the mayor, working with the administration to really understand how we can innovate to find better solutions. And what happens is you get into that journey and you discover more and more of the complexities, like the onion layer gets revealed. So some of the things we started out at the beginning of this journey thinking, well, how hard can that be? We now have a much greater appreciation of the complexity, whether that's about local policy, national policy, it's about the supply chain, it's about procurement rules, legal frameworks, capacity within the bandwidth of any complex organisation to cope with change. And a lot of that learning was done through a project that we were part of through Innovate UK, which is the UK government sort of R&D arm, where we set up a project called Enabling Housing Innovation for Inclusive Growth. And the idea was, could we then partner with a broader consortium of players, so the industry, like 9 MMC partners, Modern Methods of Construction, could we partner with the local authority? Could we partner with BRE, the British Research Establishment? Could we do something that was a think and do approach, where we would bring together warts and all, the things that we've learned, the problems that we've encountered, but looking at what is the systemic change that we need to be doing across those different agencies to create a better outcome. Now, that's a beginning of a journey. We haven't completed it, but what I'm proud of is that we've started to move forward on that. And as we've got further into it, we're learning more and more about what the complexity is. And actually the work that we're doing together through the Climate Smart Cities Challenge is a great example. We've taken some of our learning from that Innovate UK project, and we've understood a lot more about the problems and the complexity of this thing of viability in building. And we're looking again at that particular challenge through that Climate Smart Cities Challenge. So what I'm enjoying is the stakeholders that we've built together, the shared sense of political ownership about the problem, the scale of ambition in terms of, that we've helped incubate now something like, over 500 different homes in Bristol using different MMC, modern methods construction systems. But we're not there. What we're saying is there's more now we can build on that confidence to innovate again and recreate those systems. So the journey is, I think, what I'm most proud of, that we brought people with us. And actually, we're now being sort of drawing into that ecosystem, because we need more of that wisdom from other partners to really crack the complexity of the challenges that we face.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, because one of the things that we talk about and work on at Dark Matter Labs, many other innovation organisations, is a concept called orchestration, and this, which is something more than facilitation. It's somehow more deeply embedded, a local partner that can play a role of bringing people together, holding the problem space that they're dealing with, and knowing when to bring in different partners and kind of guide a process towards change. And that needs to be, often that can be done by local government, but sometimes that kind of slightly removed but still embedded role is something we talk about a lot in concept and theory, and part of why I wanted to have this conversation with you in Bristol was I feel like we found a living example of it with the Bristol Housing Festival and the close relationship you have with the council. What I wanted to ask you is, let's take as well as that kind of orchestration piece, which is about process guidance. For those who might be watching this video, can we get a little bit into the complexity of the challenge you're dealing with? What I'd love to hear about is, you talked about the kind of peeling of the onion layer, and so often we know what the challenges are at a kind of broad level, and maybe you think it's this, and then when you peel the onion you realise it's something else. Could you talk a little bit about how you ended up on this issue of viability, and for those listening, tell us a little bit about what, if you could sum up that very specific challenge that you're now working on, what is it, and how did you get through the onion to that point?
Yeah, and it's a great journey to have been on, because, as you say, it's been about orchestration and then having to build trust and confidence with those partners that we can go on that journey together. So if you think about the journey started with the sort of the broad proposition was, how, working with the local authority, can we deliver more good quality, affordable homes for those people most in housing need in our city, knowing that those homes also had to be sustainable. And so we've engaged principally with this sort of emerging supply chain and modern methods of construction in the UK, because there's a hope and an ambition there about two things. One, that supply chain is predicated on a build solution in terms of their delivery capacity, and so they're not necessarily so predicated on an assumption of land acquisition and planning uplift. It's not to demonize the current model we've got, but looking at our social housing needs and the need, how do we really move to a manufactured solution that can deliver that quality assurance and scale that we need in the UK. And as we've got into the MMC, what we've discovered is that, that's not a small pivot in terms of the way that we commission, deliver and build homes. That's a huge fundamental change. So the way that we procure through local authorities and understand best value, the way that procurement is scored, and innovation, particularly if it's the first time something's been done, is high risk. So that was a barrier. How do we engage with procurement? The legal frameworks that sits on, in terms of, when you pivot to particularly off-site manufacturing, that's a completely different legal framework and legal risks. The warranty setup that underpins the structure of that supply chain being de-risked is crucial to that as well, and that's been an emerging challenge. The mortgageability of these products, so those that are social housing will be commissioned by the local authority, but they will, to create mixed and balanced communities, some maybe need to be sold to the private sector for private owners. So how do you create mortgage? So that's been an emerging part of the story in the UK as well. And then just the whole sequencing of decision making in terms of that. So much of the experience within the built environment is around traditional build, which goes through a particular RIBA stage and frameworks. And we know that, we understand that, we know how to interrogate that and to work within that time frame. And modern methods of construction come along and kind of completely rejig the order of that decision making, the sequencing of when those decisions need to be made and how much more needs to be made from a sort of building control and planning decision earlier. So we were getting into the detail of that, and through a number of these schemes that were being delivered in Bristol, getting some confidence and some real sort of knowledge about, well, how would that work and how can we deliver that? But at the heart of that then was this even thornier issue around viability. And this is really around how particularly the affordable housing sector understands what it can afford to invest in housing. So in a perfect scenario, the council may own some land, and we say about that land, well, we're going to deliver zero carbon housing on that land, and it will be all, affordable housing. So ideally what we call social rent, which is for those people that are most in need of housing in our city, that frankly we struggle to deliver from a viability perspective. So the challenge was there, but when we got into it, we realized these issues around what we call net present value, which is a way of assessing our viability, often meant that to repay the capital as understood on day one within a time frame of 40 years, when on a brownfield site you've got more development cost, you may have smaller schemes, which means you've got less sort of density, therefore that you don't get the economies of scale. You've got all the constraints that those smaller sites will build in, but you've got the infrastructure that needs to go into that. These sites simply weren't going to be viable within their understanding and net present value. And what that means is you get into a value engineering process. So you've really only got two levers. You either pull back on the investment proposition, so you make the housing, frankly, and I don't mean this to sound too brutal, but less good quality or less sustainable, so you reduce your cost. Or the other option you've got is you change your tenure mix. So you simply say, well, we can't really afford to do social rent housing. We'll make more of it for sale, or we'll make more of it sort of more broad general needs affordable, which is okay, but it means you're not really going to hit that urgent social justice agenda need that we need to tackle in the city. So through the Climate Smart Cities Challenge, we've been really wanting to pose this question around what do we mean by viability, particularly when you've got a public body engaged that should be looking at that broader comprehension of social value, the longer term value that we're investing into our society at large. And so trying to now see how through this competition we can stretch the wisdom and the knowledge of what we mean by viability. I'm so aware that when we talk about building homes, we're not really talking about just how many houses we build. We're talking about how we improve the mental and the physical health of the population and the well-being of the planet. This should be the outcome measures that we're driving. And the reason that we feel encouraged by that is that the Climate Smart Cities Challenge can drop into a context where there's this huge social urgent need to find better solutions. And the national government is looking at this in the context of procurement, best value, the Social Value Act, and this broader sort of comprehension, something called the Construction Innovation Hub have developed something called the Values Toolkit. So we're on the money in terms of the question. And what I hope this competition will do for us is help us develop the methodology, because one of the problems for local authorities is that we may have the land, we may have the ambition, but do we have the kind of academic rigor and the capacity to really drive that delivery? So that's what we'll be doing through this Climate Smart Cities Challenge, I hope.
Fantastic, thanks, Jez. You've touched on a lot there, lots of questions, new ones that are forming in my mind. But maybe for some people listening, I remember when you first framed the challenge in Bristol, when we were doing challenge definition kind of exercise, when you, at the beginning of the process with the many partners of Climate Smart Cities Challenge, Viable Cities, UN Habitat, etc., you very strongly said this is not a technology issue. And I think you've explained all the other parts to the pie. But for someone to say, well, okay, well, if zero carbon housing is too expensive, you know how to do an affordable house, you know how to do a zero carbon house, we don't know how to do them at the same time because of this affordability question. Why not just invest in sort of, we just need to basically accelerate that technology innovation curve that brings down the cost, makes this scalable, and to make zero carbon housing, you know, of similar cost to any other type of housing. Why did you not go down that route? Why is that not an adequate answer to the challenges that you've just described?
Yeah, and in theory, it should. I mean, you know, you've just set out an incredibly cogent answer to the problem. And I think, just to be clear, the reason we're saying it's not a technological solution is that we know that there are housing systems and there are energy systems that can create, effectively moving into that embodied net zero carbon space. So you know, there is, yes, admittedly, more work to do about the definitions of what we mean by embodied carbon. Certainly in use carbon, we can do net zero. So we're moving into that space where we can create homes that are potentially sort of positive carbon contributors in terms of actually taking through the building materials and the way they're insulated, making a positive contribution. So the technology is there in principle, but this is about cost. It's about scale. It's about the existing housing industry and the commissioners of that housing to engage with this new way of working. And so what you come across are system blockers that prevent that happening in any kind of credible way. And so I've touched on things like procurement. So the comprehension of best value. When you get into what we mean by best value, all too often, I'm afraid, we have an assumption that best value looks like the cheapest cost on day one from a capital perspective. Not saying, well, how does this contribute for the next 500 years to contribute to our clean air agenda and our sustainability agenda? A good example there is that I can build a house today that will be about £30,000-40,000 cheaper, but it won't even comply with the future Part L standards coming out. But to retrofit a house will cost an extra £30,000 on top. So we've got a problem in the way that we procure things. We've got a problem, therefore, in the way that so much of the industry, the way that we build homes, is driven from this viability concept. And therefore, the take-up of that technology at scale is, well, whose job is that? Whose job is it to say, we're going to stop making profit over here and we're going to take a massive risk on where there's no legislative framework to say we have to do this, to change our supply chain, to invest in and incubate a whole new supply chain of skills and technology. That's the missing piece in this. And ultimately, housing is about land. Housing is driven from land supply, which is why at the moment so much of our infrastructure and our business is aimed at the acquisition of land. So my simple belief is, if we can get local authorities and the public sector to take its responsibility seriously, to say, well, we have collectively a significant land supply that we can bring to this. And as we bring our land supply into this space, we need to be very clear about what our intended outcomes are for that land. So yes, it's about delivering quality housing. Yes, it's about affordable housing, but crucially, it needs to also be about pivoting to help incubate that new supply chain. And if we can't do that because we have our own complex systems of procurement, viability, legal frameworks, best value decision-making that can't enable that, how can we expect the private sector to do that? And I don't think you can. I think it would be lovely to think they could, but I think that in terms of the sort of the process of capitalism, it's very difficult when you've got a shareholder board demanding profit to do that. But land is the key. Land is king here. So local authorities can. So we're trying to say, let's do that now, incubate that supply chain. That does then help de-risk it. Legislation will eventually catch up in terms of the reforms that we're seeing for housing standards. But if you wait for the legislation, you've missed the opportunity to really drive that innovation further and de-risk it to allow it to be scalable. So for me, there's a real gift here about the public sector understanding its responsibility and opportunity to help drive that change. And we've got to align our complex systems to enable that, not be a barrier to that growth.
You talk about the importance of working within the frameworks that you have and pushing the boundaries, but getting stuff done. That's very much your approach. And so in Innovate UK project that you mentioned, that I'm sure we can share a link to in this content that will accompany our little interview, you actually built houses. I mean, it's important to say that it was an innovation project where you'd had a lot of learning, focusing on some critical challenges, but you also built. And in the Climate Smart Cities Challenge, taking a similar approach where you're going to have sites where houses will be built. But how do you avoid the kind of pilot project trap where you, because you're working to actually build something, you put an awful lot of extra effort and time into this innovation journey, and so much so that you've kind of created what could be a perfect house, but all of those big structural barriers that you're kind of working within still remain. And so the kind of promise of the innovation, this sort of systems innovation journey that you're going for, at the end of the day, you create what we sometimes call beautiful exceptions. So wonderful projects, but ones that will never be replicated. So, and I don't think anyone has the answer perfectly to this, but what's your approach? What are you trying to do? What are you trialing and learning, both, in the Climate Smart Cities Challenge, or what do you hope to trial and learn in the future to avoid that kind of beautiful exception trap?
Yeah, and that I think is the risk, that you kind of get political favour and opportunity, and you kind of do this wonderful project that everyone sort of gives awards to, but it will never happen again. I think what we've tried to do, and I'm impatient to see change, and I've had to learn, I think, a pretty healthy dose of patience through this, is that if we really want to create change that can be replicated, we have to work in and through the system, not despite it. And that is frustrating, because the system will come with people whose job it is to create safeguards and checks and balances and to prevent innovation in a way, because it's like, well, that's not been done before. So you either go around those people to get something done at perhaps arguably quicker pace, but it means the door is not open for the next person to come through. So we have taken longer, particularly, I think, looking at some of these more complicated issues. And one of the things we're trying to do through our reports when we is really to share people the journey that we've been on, working with the local authority to explore, well, how do we do this safely? How do we do this within your governance constructs? How do we do this within public law? But also using the expertise of the industry of saying, well, we'd love to be able to do this, but you're the problem. So how can you help us find a route through this? So I think we've had to go, I suppose, in some ways we've had to go slower than the original ambition, but I think the key is we've done it through the system, so that the things that we're doing are not that beautiful exemplar that sit on the outside. There is a framework of solutions here that taps into the legal, the procurement rules, taps into the way that the development team now can engage and replicate that solution. Because if otherwise, the risk is you to do any innovation takes an awful lot of investment of time. It just does, because you've not done it before. So if we're going to invest that time to create that credibility for further use and value, it's so important that we've gone through the system. And the system will bend, because the system is maintained by people who ultimately are still aligning to, we need to deliver homes. But we're kind of stress testing the system, and we have to recognize, and I've had to learn this, that there are people whose job it is to say no, and they're not being difficult. They're there because the system is built around a certain understanding of, let's say, value and safeguards, and we've had to really do that homework. So I suppose it's taken time. It's taken time to build trust with people. We've also had to sometimes accept that we can't do everything. And so it's accepting that we're not aiming for perfection in round one. We're aiming for a momentum of journey that says, this is the direction of travel we're heading in. We're going to bring you with us. And each time as we iterate, it will get better and better and better, because we'll improve the way that we understand, measure, and deliver ultimately system change and better outcomes.
Yeah.
One final thing back to us as a shared challenge of the Climate Smart Cities Challenge, if I may, is, for me, the passion with this is the social justice agenda. When I think about the Climate Smart Cities Challenge, we talk a lot about, rightly, zero carbon housing. But the risk is that the built environment could turn around tomorrow and say, well, that's it, we will build zero carbon housing. And we won't now in the UK allow that with, buildings that aren't zero carbon. But this is the viability. If we don't do it in a way that has a social justice theme to it that says, but we can do this in a way to build houses for those in most desperate need. At the core of our sustainability agenda, we are creating greater systemic poverty. And that poverty is one of the biggest barriers to how we were going to fix the challenge that we face. So for all of us that work for the Housing Festival and working very close with the council, we are there's a human cost to this, and it's very easy when you focus on houses to forget that actually this is about people, it's about communities, it is about justice, and that is what drives me. And it's a huge motivation, but it's also a hugely pressurized time. And we're seeing now, again in the UK, in terms of interest rates, the cost of living crisis, the energy crisis, we have not got time to keep pontificating about the right way. We need to be moving at pace and scale now. So the urgency increases, but the ability, therefore, to work through the system and change the system for better outcomes is going to be a crucial part of our learning together.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jez. Well, thank you so much for taking this time to share a bit about your motivations, your learnings. We've certainly really enjoyed working with Bristol Housing Festival and the Bristol City Council on this Climate Smart Cities Challenge, and I'm really excited to see the journey as it unfolds now that you're getting really into the crunch period of delivering on these challenges that you've raised. So thanks a lot for the chat, and speak soon.
Yeah, pleasure. And likewise, thanks to you, Stephen. Take care. Cheers. Bye-bye.